Several hours had now passed since the execution of the ambush, and the argument about what course of action the platoon should take had been raging ever since. The main reason behind this unexpected internal conflict was that those in favour of either side of the debate had somehow managed to end up perfectly matched in number. For the Tenente and those behind him, the answer was simple. Elements of the German army should be holed up somewhere nearby. Linking back up with their allies offered the best chance for their survival. But for Sergeant Garza and his followers, the opportunity to surrender to their attackers was not one to be missed, far preferable to the ongoing risk of being captured by their own vengeful countrymen. One person whose fate was perhaps most affected by this argument, his identity prompting the call to surrender, was the wounded Allied soldier currently being helped along the trail by Baresi and another private named Monte. The revelation that the sole survivor of the unit they had just ambushed was Brazilian, part of a broader US force surging north towards Parma, immediately fueled the argument that now was the time to capitulate. The Latin American soldiers were relative newcomers to the conflict, their leaders having desperately tried to avoid entering the war, only for the repeated sinking of their merchantmen by U-boats finally forcing their hand. The dwindling forces of Mussolini's Italian Republic had found their new opponents to be both tenacious and professional in battle, but more importantly, far less likely to murder them out of hand. Indeed, it was the fear of being forcibly handed over by the advancing Allied armies to fighters from the Italian resistance that motivated the Socialists to continue fighting, despite the overwhelming odds they faced. There had been far too many rumours of the torture and summary execution of their former leaders by the bloodthirsty Republican fighters. Such a prospect made death in battle seem far less intimidating. Garza had passionately argued, until his voice had turned hoarse, that the Brazilians were the least likely of their pursuers to allow the platoon to fall into partisan hands, and now was the time to give in. But as the NCO had visibly won more of the men to his way of thinking, the lieutenant had finally lost patience, turning a crimson shade of red and ordering them to gather their equipment and fall back to the German lines. And so, the platoon laboured on in silence, making their way north, taking care to avoid the main roads which were populated with enemies who possessed varying degrees of murderous intent. The light had just started to fade when those at the head of the column came to an unexpected halt. There, not far further ahead, was what appeared to be the overgrown stone skeleton of a church of some kind. As the scouts had slowly fanned out to encircle the ruined building, Baresi met the inquiring gaze of his fellow soldier, the pair taking the opportunity to gently lower their wounded prisoner down to the ground. The youth was in a bad way, there was no doubting that, with blood still seeping through the bandages that had been hastily tied across the 2 bullet holes buried in his torso. Baresi watched on apprehensively as Private Monte supported a canteen to the soldier's mouth, unsure how the Brazilian had managed to cling on to life for as long as he had. A few moments later, the scouts returned, assuring their commanding officer that the remains of the church were empty, with no sign that anybody had been inside it for some time. With a wave of his hand, the lieutenant ordered the column to move forward again, the open unwillingness with which his men complied indicative of the fatigue and weariness that had typified their journey thus far. Whilst the bulk of the Italian soldiers immediately settled down amidst the safety of the thick stone blocks, several were reluctantly detailed to take up defensive positions on the approaches to the ruined building. Temporarily transferring the weight of their patient to his colleague, Baresi hurriedly unfurled his bedroll. Having smoothed it out between a couple of toppled pillars, he then moved to help Monte gently lower the soldier down onto it. Several fires were soon lit, and what little remained of the platoon's rations were passed around. But the thorny issue of surrender still loomed as large as the shadows that seemed to be closing in on the weary socialist fighters. It was clear the lieutenant was not to be persuaded, remaining adamant they should push on to the German positions. How far he was prepared to prevent Garza and the others from deserting remained to be seen. With a sigh, Baresi lit one of his few remaining cigarettes, taking a drag, then passing it down to his wounded prisoner. The Brazilian accepted it with a weak smile, before coughing violently, nearly dropping the gift in the process. Having exchanged a knowing look with Monte, the Italian then lit another cigarette for himself, leaning back against a section of toppled wall as he pondered on the decisions that had ultimately led him to this place. An angry cry unexpectedly raised Baresi from his slumber, his hand reflexively reaching for his rifle. Like most of his fellow soldiers, he had sworn he would not allow himself to be captured and degraded by their opponents. As the fires were hastily extinguished and the platoon began to form up in defensive positions, it quickly became apparent that it had not been anybody inside the church who had sounded the alarm. For a few minutes there was confusion, with the lieutenant issuing a series of orders that were swiftly countermanded by his senior NCO. But just at the point the two men were coming to blows, several figures stumbled out of the darkness. The two sentries breathlessly explained that they had been sat up on guard when they had heard the faint sounds of what sounded like laughter coming from somewhere not far from the church. They had silently worked their way along a dirt path, finally happening upon a cloaked figure that was slowly making its way towards the ruins where their colleagues rested. Following a brief struggle, to their surprise, the sentries had discovered the intruder appeared to be an old woman. More astonishing was the fact that she appeared to be in a grimy blindfold tied around the top of her head, completely obscuring her eyes. Initially, the pair had been unsure what to do with their prisoner, who was becoming more agitated and aggressive towards them with each passing minute. Finally, fearful if they allowed her on her way, she may warn their pursuers, they had tied and bound the woman before bundling her back down a path towards the church. Clearly irritated by this unwanted development, the lieutenant ordered that the number of sentries be doubled, glaring icily at Garza, who grudgingly acknowledged the order. He then approached the elderly prisoner, demanding to know who she was and where she had come from. The reply to his inquiry, and to all the other questions that followed, was cackling laughter. Eventually, tiring at being mocked and ridiculed by the seemingly hysterical crone, the officer directed her captors to gag her and deposit her in a corner of the church until the following morning. Gradually, the tension and fear that had gripped the troops began to ease a little, and those lucky enough to avoid guard duty cautiously settled back down again in an effort to catch a few hours' precious rest. For the second time that evening, Baresi's eyes snapped open once again, his hand reaching for his gun before he realised he had no idea what it was that had caused him to wake. Slowly rising to his feet, he listened intently for any sign of danger, but the only sound to be heard was the snoring and restless movements of the sleeping soldiers sprawled around the ruins. Relieved, he stretched out his arms and was considering whether or not to expend another of his last cigarettes when the faintest hint of a sound suddenly caught his attention. Several of the fires had been relit by the men as they had settled back down, and by the dim light being cast by the furthest one, he could just about make out the two sentries, slumbering on the ground beside the blindfolded female prisoner. Taking a step forwards, Baresi could now see that she had somehow managed to work the gag free from her mouth, and was apparently whispering something. Every so often, the volume of her voice would rise a little, and he would catch the faint sound of her words, which were being spoken in a language he did not recognise. Irritated at having been awoken, and that his two fellow soldiers had not only fallen asleep, but also allowed her to slip her gag, Baresi began to make his way across the church towards the trio. Suddenly, there was a sharp cracking noise from behind him, as if a large piece of wood had been violently split in two. The unexpected sound paralysed the soldier, who immediately stopped in his tracks, hoping that what he had heard had merely been a product of his exhausted imagination. But moments later it came again, hollow and haunting, causing him to turn and investigate. To his horror, he saw the Brazilian soldier, his back arched high, head and feet lifting off the ground. As Baresi watched on, the injured prisoner's eyes suddenly snapped open, radiating a bright green light of some kind. The man's mouth widened as it suddenly started to scream, and his bones cracked again, noisily, as his back arched even higher. With a nervous shriek, Baresi raised his rifle, aiming it first at the spasming prisoner, before turning and levelling it again at the elderly hag, who continued to whisper away to herself, regardless. Several of the men had now been woken, and as they too saw what was going on, they began to shout and yell amongst themselves. Suddenly, A shot rang out, the bullet from the lieutenant's sidearm catching the writhing prisoner in the side of his torso, the force of the round pitching him sideways onto his front. But in an instant, and with unnatural swiftness, the Brazilian was up on his feet. His eyes were ablaze now, with an almost blinding green flame, jaw fixed wide open as one arm raised to point at the officer. The bullet hole in his side was also glowing now, but the light radiating out from it was intermittent, almost as if something were moving around between it and the skin that covered it. Swearing loudly, the lieutenant advanced on the prisoner, angrily berating the men he passed for taking no action. Levelling his pistol directly at the prisoner's face, he pulled the trigger, firing a bullet directly into the young soldier's forehead. As more green light immediately shone forth from the hole that had been blasted into the Brazilian's head, something simultaneously exploded outwards from the glowing wound in his side. The assembled soldiers caught a brief glimpse of a thick tentacle shape, which instantly buried itself directly into the chest of their commanding officer. For a few seconds, it flexed and twisted, the light from the fires playing across its glistening surface, and then suddenly it went taut, drawing the hapless officer towards where they stood. There was a frightened cry, and another glowing hole immediately appeared in the Brazilian's chest. It was quickly followed by another, and another, as more of the terrified socialist soldiers opened fire. The lieutenant was screaming, as yet more dark undulating feelers issued forth from the Brazilian's wounds, burying themselves deep into his flesh. Despite his frantic struggling, he was being drawn closer and closer to the wounded soldier, until the two figures made contact, the sinister appendages that were emerging from the Brazilian, hugging him tighter and tighter. Baresi swung round, searching for the blindfolded crone, only to find her now gone, the attention of the sentries completely fixed on what was taking place behind him. When he turned again, what he saw chilled him to the bone. The officer and prisoner were now almost indistinguishable, rendered into a single writhing mass of human flesh. The fabric of their uniforms and the skin of their bodies seemed to be disappearing into one another, their arms and legs dissolving into shapeless forms. Every rifle bullet that pierced the surface of this nightmarish vision exposed another patch of glowing green light, a further whipping feeler emerging to tear its way up out of the hole that had been caused. The soldier nearest this chaos was suddenly speared by one of the snake-like protrusions, and then savagely yanked off his feet just as his commanding officer had been. His panicked cries merged with those of the lieutenant before another of the Italians was similarly ensnared and dragged into the fleshy mass. The air was thick with a chorus of agonised howls and wails as man after man disappeared into the fray, their individuality slowly melting away into a sea of moving horror. This nightmarish entity began to move forward, not walking, as anything that had previously been a leg was now long gone, but flowing. As it made its way through the ruins, feelers whipping out in all directions, seizing soldiers, forcibly incorporating them into its bloated form. Turning to run, Baresi felt something hammer into his back, and then suddenly he was face down, being pulled backwards along the harsh and stony ground. As the darkness rose up around him, the doomed Italian soldier heard what he thought was the sound of mocking laughter, hard to distinguish over the screams of his comrades. And then, there was nothing. In the end, it had been the death of Sergeant Goad that had finally broken what little resolve the men of the 148th Reserve Division still possessed. The veteran NCO had spent the duration of the Italian campaign pulling the men under his command back into line, urging them to fight on for their lives and for those of their comrades if nothing else. But when Wittmann had seen the man he had marched into both Belgium and France alongside, blown apart by an Allied shell, he had turned and run, followed by what was left of his company. Those heady days, when their unit had first occupied Épinal and in the suburbs of Paris seemed a lifetime ago, replaced by an endless cycle of loss and retreat that had characterised their campaign in Italy. A shout from the front of the column shook the demoralised German infantryman from his thoughts, and he found himself hurrying forward, urging those around him to flatten themselves low to the ground. Crouching down alongside Dietrich, another of the company's surviving veterans, he cautiously surveyed the crumbling stone structure that lay in their path. Signalling for a couple more of the survivors to join them, the two soldiers rose up, advancing slowly on the abandoned building, their weapons held high. From the moment he stepped inside, Wittmann knew something was very wrong with this place. The ground was littered with abandoned weapons and equipment, with no trace of the fighters they had belonged to. Cautiously picking their way through the chaos, the Germans were startled by a pained moan, turning to find a wounded Italian soldier sat propped up against one of the church's damaged stone columns. Shouldering his rifle, Wittmann reached around for his first aid pouch, leaning down to examine the injured soldier's wounds. But as he did so, there was a commotion from outside. Ordering the other soldiers to help the beleaguered Italian, he motioned for Dietrich to join him and hurried out. The rest of the company was turned to one side, weapons trained on a squat figure that had now materialized from a nearby tree line. The newcomer's eyes were covered over with some sort of bandage or rag. It was difficult to gauge from this distance, but she appeared to be an elderly local woman. Motioning for the others to lower their weapons, the German soldier stepped forward to meet the newcomer, only to be halted in his tracks by a shrill outburst of cackling laughter. On the floor inside the church, Baresi's eyelids suddenly snapped open, the two Germans beside him falling backwards as he surveyed them with eyes that burned a vivid shade of green.